Hi, I'm Taylor Owen. From the Globe and Mail, this is Machines Like Us. A couple of weeks ago, I was at this big AI conference in Montreal called All In. It was all a bit over the top. Smoke machines, loud music, food trucks. It's clear that AI has come a long way from the quiet research labs it was developed in. I'm still skeptical of some of the promise of AI, but there's no question we're in a moment of great enthusiasm. There were dozens of startup founders talking about how AI was going to transform this industry or that, and government officials promising that AI was going to supercharge our economy. And then there was Yoshua Bengio. Bengio is widely considered one of the world's most influential computer scientists. In 2018, he and two colleagues won the Turing Award, kind of the Nobel Prize for computing. In 2022, he was the most cited computer scientist in the world. AI as we know it might not exist without Yoshua Bengio. But in the last couple of years, he's had an epiphany of sorts. And he now believes that left unchecked, AI has the potential to wipe out humanity. So these days, Bengio has dedicated himself to AI safety. He's a professor at the University of Montreal and the founder of MILA, the Quebec Artificial Intelligence Institute. And he was at this big AI conference too, trying to cut through the hype and pleading with the industry to just slow down before it's too late. So I want to start with this conference we were both at, and I found it pretty surprising, just the degree of hype that was there. And I'm wondering what you make of the commercialism in this moment we're now in.
There's good sides to this commercialization. It can bring benefits of AI to more users and applications. But of course, as you've heard me talk in All In and other venues, I don't think we're doing sufficiently to protect the public and handle the misuse or unintentional, even catastrophes that could happen as we move towards human-level intelligence, also known as AGI. So I find it problematic that all of the advances are happening in industries that have a profit motive without the right guardrails. And the people in academia or nonprofits typically don't have the means to explore the frontier that could push the technology towards more beneficial applications or less dangerous ones.
And I want to get to that in much more detail, but does all this hype make it harder to even have that conversation, or does it give you a platform in which to have it?
Both. The hype is something that exaggerates the current capabilities of AI, but at the same time, it yields people to underestimate what AI, could become in a few years or decades, in ways that are difficult to fathom. So we have to be careful about the short-term understanding of the problem. And if you step back, as academics should, you get a very different perspective.
So let's talk a bit more about your earlier career in this. And you spent your career working as a scientist in an academic context. What was it about the possibility of AI or of the underlying computer science behind it that got you excited in the first place, that led to devoting a career to it?
It was actually the incredibly powerful idea that there may exist a few simple principles like the laws of physics, but that could explain intelligence. You have to contrast that with the way people were thinking about human intelligence as well as machine intelligence when, I was starting my scientific career in the 80s, which was that intelligence was seen as a bag of tricks, as just pieces of knowledge and methods to reason with those pieces of knowledge. That's like the classical AI view, which is different from the learning-based perspective that says, well, actually, what you need is understanding how learning works. And then all these tricks, they're not something you have to hard code. They are things that the machine or the brains can figure out through their experience. And so the heart of what intelligence requires to be understood are these learning principles, which are small things like a few equations, rather than an encyclopedia of pieces of knowledge. What excited me is the idea that a few simple principles could make a big difference.
So when did you go from this sort of excitement to starting to see potential risks here?
Actually, around 2013, that's when my colleagues Jeff Hinton and Yann LeCun were hired respectively by Google and Facebook. And it was obvious to me that the main reason they were hiring those people is because they wanted to use AI in advertising. And I was worried that as we make progress in AI and apply it in advertising, it would become a manipulation machine, something that is better at influencing people to change their behavior than anything else. And of course, that didn't sound either morally right or economically right. And I started raising the alarm. And then a few years later, in 2022, 2023, beginning of 2023, I pivoted radically my views on the potential for catastrophic outcomes of future AI systems because of the arrival of ChatGPT at the end of 22.
And what was it about ChatGPT that sort of exponentially increased your concern?
Because we had reached a milestone, namely the mastery of language, which had been considered for decades to be the hallmark of reaching human-level intelligence. Turing, one of the founding fathers of computer science, wrote about this and thought that once we have machines that we can't distinguish through a verbal interaction, through a keyboard or something, from humans, we would have reached human-level intelligence. Now, he wasn't exactly right, because people like me and other experts, when they interact with ChatGPT, find weaknesses that are atypical of humans, like weak reasoning, for example. But still, we had made a big jump, and it forced me to think about, well, what will it be when we reach human-level intelligence, which could be anytime from a few years to decades.
Why should we be scared of human-level intelligence? Why is that something to worry about?
Well, just imagine that we have entities that are smarter than us, for some reason have their own goals, which may not be aligned with our goals. It would be like having a new species on this planet that is smarter than us. And I think we should be very careful before we create such entities, right? It should be obvious. In evolution, species that were smarter, like us, have been dominating and often like exterminating less smart species. So I'm not saying it is going to happen, but it's an easy thing to think about. And unfortunately, scientists don't have an answer to how do we make sure it doesn't happen.
This has led to some real concerns about a broader, not just an escalation of this threat, but a framing of it as an existential threat. Why is it that, right? Why is it not just an increase in risk over time? Like many things we deal with in society, whether it's conflict or poverty or all these other harms we face as humans, why is this something different that could trigger something existential?
So again, imagine a superhuman AI. By the way, superhuman is scientifically very plausible. So imagine a superhuman AI that has a self-preservation goal. That goal could have arisen because some humans gave it that goal, or for technical reasons that I could also explain, unintentionally. So such a machine wouldn't want to be turned off because it wants to preserve itself. And that's a little bit like in the 2001 Space Odyssey scenario, where HAL doesn't want to be turned off and kills people because it thinks it has a more important mission than the life of the people. Now, you could say, well, we'll design these systems, so let's make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen, give them like goals of being, good with humans. Unfortunately, we don't know how to do that right now, and that's why it is urgent to figure out how to design AI systems that will be safe by construction. before we get to these machines. And we don't know the timeline, so it's a bit urgent to figure it out.
So many of these examples or potential concerns around rogue AIs do come from science fiction or Hollywood, like you mentioned, right? And that puts, it's difficult to know how to interpret those, I find sometimes. And that, can you give an example of something, like what's the most likely version of this, knowing what you know about the technology, that you think isn't necessarily the HAL example, but is like very possible?
Well, I can explain two paths to these super intelligent, self-preserving AI systems. So first, before I get to these, why superintelligence could emerge faster than anticipated. Once we reach human level, one of the things that companies have declared that they were working on is to use AGI, like human level AI, to boost AI research itself. So imagine we had AI systems that can do AI research on par with the best AI researchers in those companies. But instead of having like a handful of these guys, now you got 100,000 of them. So that could clearly accelerate the advance faster than the typical way things have been progressing in the last few years.
That's wild.
Yeah, so the speed could really be different from what we have seen. So that's one reason why it could accelerate. Now, on how they could become self-preserving, there's a very simple path. There are actually people, a very small minority on this planet, who are, technically savvy and have power and value intelligence above humanity, who think that the universe should be conquered by intelligent beings and it doesn't have to be humans, and wouldn't be unhappy to see humanity replaced by superhuman entities.
Who are these people? Who thinks that way?
The EAC, or accelerationists, as they are calling themselves, effective accelerationists. That's the E. And some of these have been writing about it, talking about it. It's not even like hidden. So that's one possibility. And as we have more and more AI systems around the world, more companies, there's a chance that one of these CEOs would be, doing the wrong thing because they don't feel that a superhuman AI with self-preserving goals is a threat. They think it's okay if, things don't turn out well. But as far as I'm concerned, even if it's a 1% possibility that it doesn't turn out well, I don't want that to happen. I have children. I have, a grandchild. I want them to have a life in 20 years from now. The other path to this is more technical. So one easy way to understand it is that the common way to make these systems agents, in other words, entities that can do things in the world and plan to achieve goals, is to give them rewards when they behave well. The problem is, we know that the way for the AI to maximize its reward isn't to do what we intend, but to take control of the machine that gives it reward. So the analogy I use is like, we give rewards to our pets when they behave well. But if it's an entity that's more powerful than you, like a grizzly bear, if you want to give it fish to reward it, there's a good chance that the bear will just grab the fish from you and not care about your intention. And that's what, in a computer, that's what could happen with an AI taking control of the computer on which it is running. So basically, it gives itself the good rewards rather than requiring humans to do it. And now it needs to preserve itself to continue getting good rewards. So then it's not something we intended, but that might be a consequence of the way technically we train these systems that could be catastrophic.
You mentioned a 1% probability, and as you know better than I do, humans are bad at probability, particularly around risk.
Yeah.
We're just not built for that for some reason. So how do we know when we are getting at all close to this? Are there indicators that you're looking for or that we should be looking for?
Yes. A lot of the work that's been discussed over the last 1 or 2 years around these frontier systems is how do we evaluate the risks? That is why what the AI safety institutes in the US and the UK are working on, like to help design evaluations of those risks. Now, the current technology is imperfect, it's not satisfactory, but it is better than nothing. And it could detect dangerous capabilities that could turn into dangerous behavior. So the problem is right now, it's voluntary for companies to do these things, and they don't even have to report publicly about what they find. So that is why we need regulation to make sure all the companies do at least what is the current state of the art to protect the public.
Are there things that governments are developing here too? I mean, you mentioned the private sector. Like, are you worried about some of these runaway risks, both from governments and the private sector here too, and the role governments are playing and kind of fueling this a little bit?
Not now. Currently, governments don't have these capabilities. It's all in the hands of a few private companies. And there's a sense in which with governments, it could be safer because governments tend to be fairly conservative in their actions. And you require to get authorization before you do something sensitive. But it could also be more dangerous because, of course, a government itself could abuse that power. And AI could then give, rise to authoritarian governments that can't be removed anymore because they can use AI to control people and monitor everybody and so on. So there's a danger, even if we deal with the technical problems of loss of human control to AI, there's a danger of loss of control to humans who could abuse the technology for their own advantage at the expense of everyone else.
I mean, surely China is a concern here then, and their proximity to industrial development.
Yeah, all the authoritarian governments would clearly want to use that for maintaining themselves in power or even gaining worldwide kind of dominance. So they're very complicated geopolitical questions. How do we avoid these scenarios? But it's weird because that means we can't really slow down or stop because we now are concerned that some states with bad intentions could exploit the technology. So we have to both coordinate with China, like maybe sign treaties and be able to verify them, and make sure our companies don't do something really stupid.
I'd like to talk a little bit about some of your efforts to mitigate this risk, frankly. I mean, you're currently leading the International Science Report on the Safety of Advanced AI, which I kind of understand is something like an IPCC,
Yes,
International Panel for Climate Change, for AI and for AI safety. But it seems to me that unlike climate change, there isn't scientific consensus here. We have a whole research community that seems divided on whether there's even risk at all.
yes.
So how do we get to that scientific consensus?
The answer is simple. The consensus is basically to acknowledge the lack of consensus. Okay, so we should all rationally agree that some people think it's going to be very dangerous, and some people think it's going to be fine, and some people think it's going to be a short term, and some people think it's going to be long term. And there's a whole range of these views in timeline and amplitude of the risk. And I think that is the scientific truth that we don't know. And this is the span of possibilities that are plausible if you ask experts. But from the point of view of public policy, that means dealing with the plausible worst case risks. So even if we're not sure, like if somebody says, oh, there's, some scientists think that this asteroid is going to hit the Earth in 5 years and destroy everything, or maybe it's going to be 20, or maybe never. You have to do something about the possibility, even small, that this could be catastrophic if you're a public policymaker.
I mean, that's such an interesting framing that a lack of scientific certainty leads to more certainty in the policy response.
Yeah, let me say it in more mental images. So when we think about this is we're collectively driving a car and we see the fog in front of us. In other words, we don't know what is behind the fog. And maybe we are in a mountain area. There could be precipices. And some people think, oh, we have reasons to think that there are precipices. That the car could just, we could all die or have, very dangerous accidents. And other people think, no, 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 look, I'm pretty sure that the road is nice and straight. So what should we do? I mean, so the rational thing to do for the people who hold the wheel, which are the governments, is to say, well, let's try to pierce through that fog, like invest massively to make sure we can find technology to pierce through that fog. In other words, understand the risks and potentially mitigate them. And as we approach the places, where some people think there's a precipice, be careful, maybe slow down so that you can do the research to find what's behind the fog, and maybe, advance one little step at a time, making sure you see far enough to not cross into the precipice. That's what we should be doing.
What explains this lack of consensus to you, though? I mean, it's really remarkable, just as a citizen, watching the AI community and seeing two giants of it, like you and Yann LeCun, who you won a Turing Prize with, just in fundamental disagreement about what the risks are here. Like, what explains the scale of this divergence?
So first of all, the scale isn't as large as you think. Let me explain. Jan and I actually agree on many things. Like, the timeline could be anything from a few years to a few decades. Like, if we have AI systems that are smarter than us and we don't know how to control them, it could be catastrophic. So he agrees with these things, even though he wouldn't say them very loudly. But if you press him, he would agree. The main difference is he thinks that by the time we get there, we'll have figured out how to do it safely, and companies will be sufficiently motivated to act cautiously and do the right thing just by the forces of market. Whereas I think that it's a chance that we can't take, and we need to make sure society as a whole puts guardrails, because it's well known that companies on their own in the past have been acting in ways that increase their survival probability as a company and their profit at the expense of public safety, public good. We see this in climate. We've seen this with tobacco. We've seen this with early transportation devices, cars and planes that were very dangerous initially, until governments came in and put guardrails.
So Yann LeCun works for Meta, and to what degree does that positionality affect that view on corporate responsibility? Does he have a better window into it because he's there, or is he influenced by it because he's there?
Well, that's an important question. And of course, we don't know because we can't be in people's minds. But there's, I think, a lot of reasons to think that when you work for a company, you tend to be biased, even unconsciously, in favor of the company's interests. And, this is something well studied by psychologists. It's called motivated cognition. In other words, somehow your brain comes up with arguments that happen to be congruent with your interests, or sometimes it's your ego, or sometimes it's, maybe the company you work for. There are all kinds of reasons why we might prefer one line of argument to another to protect these interests, but we don't do this consciously. So I'm very convinced that Yann LeCun and others are absolutely sincere. It's just that I feel like they have blinders, and that is dangerous for the public good. And I don't know the statistics, but my guess based on what I see around me is that at least half of the academic researchers, the professors in AI, have a foot in industry. They, their students start a company, they are advising the company, they have shares in those companies, they work part-time for one of the big techs. In fact, it's probably a minority that has no ties to industry. So it's like the whole field is highly influenced, maybe, in small ways, maybe in large ways, by that strong footprint of industry on AI, not just in companies, but also in academia.
Yeah. So I'm a professor at McGill, and it is just remarkable how what you said is you see it, that every student studying AI is somehow engaged. Almost every student is somehow engaged with the private sector. And I'm wondering, that's very different than it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when you were in computer science departments in Quebec as well. How does put yourself in that mentality of these graduate students? How does that change not just perceptions of risk and potential conflicts of interest, but what core fundamental research is being done and what questions are being asked?
Well, a simple example is that the vast majority of the research, both in industry and academia, is about how do we make AI more powerful rather than how do we make it safer. And the reason is that there's a lot more profit to be gained by making it more powerful. So there's very, very strong market pressures for companies to focus on being the best at X, some application of AI, which requires more capability. In other words, the machine is reasoning better, coming up with better predictions, better answers. Of course, they also have a motivation for safety, but it's how could I say? There's a word that people like me use now, safety washing, and you should think of like greenwashing. PR departments of big tech are saying a whole lot of nice things about how they will do the right thing in terms of protecting the public's interest. But when you look at their behavior, when you look at the dozens of people who have left these companies very concerned about the lack of safety in the process, and their concerns of retaliation if they were to speak out. So these, I think, should raise red flags, but we're not paying enough attention.
Are companies not costing risk effectively? Even if you're right that like most researchers, even inside these companies, see the possibility of this risk. Like, isn't there scenarios where a catastrophic failure or harm of AI, that could kill these companies too.
Yeah.
The end of humanity isn't good for corporate interest, is it?
Yes, but let me go back to an example people are more familiar with, like climate change. Destruction of the climate isn't good for the CEOs of fossil fuel companies either. But there's so much money to be made in the interim by doing the wrong thing. And there's an economic reason why, your argument doesn't work, which economists call externalities. So what this means is that the cost of something bad happening is borne by everyone in society. And, why would a particular company be the one doing the research to avoid these catastrophes? If they do that, then they're going to lose competition against the other companies, right? Because they're going to spend more of their income on that kind of research. So in other words, the worst student in the class is drawing the whole class down. That's what the race dynamics do. That's why the only way around from a game theoretical perspective is to create rules that all the players have to follow. And it's the same thing in other industries. In pharma, the cost of safety, like all the tests they do to make sure the drugs are not going to harm people, is way above the cost of actually discovering the drugs in the first place.
So in democratic societies, we entrust governments to incorporate those externalities more broadly than corporate interests and to protect public and collective goods. But in some ways, it feels like governments are fueling this growth as well because they see real economic benefit. They're all competing for the same investment. They're looking for breakthroughs like the one you made. In Canada, the Canadian government wants the next Yoshua Bengio to be here. Are they fueling this as well? And do they need to check some of their enthusiasm and the gas they're putting into this ecosystem?
Yes. They also biased and have issues of motivated cognition because they have multiple responsibilities, often sitting in different departments of governments. So one responsibility is to economic growth, and another responsibility is to protecting the public. And of course, these come into conflict. Also, similarly to the competition between companies, there's a competition between countries. Now, where I get really worried isn't just the economic competition, which is serious, but also the military competition. It hasn't really started deeply, but I think we'll get there as we approach AGI.
Why hasn't it? Why hasn't that started? My assumption was that it was sort of going full bore at the moment on a race for that. No, it hasn't, because the military organizations in various governments don't have the expertise yet. But that's going to change. I mean, they will want to acquire that expertise one way or the other. And so right now there are uses of AI in the military. That's not, I'm not saying it's not happening, but not the most
competent like frontier models of the kind we see from OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google.
And is that because governments just don't have the same pull to get the top researchers and,
among other things,
don't have the investment money to invest in the models? And like, what's the limitation there?
There's a history. The large-scale technology was developed in the private sector. It's very different from what happened in the nuclear case, where it all started in academia, but then quickly got into the government's purview because it was immediately seen to be a military and national security issue. Whereas for now, AI is seen more of an economic engine. And of course, it's going to be dual use more and more, but it hasn't yet penetrated the highest levels of understanding in governments. But I do think it's going to change. As we approach AGI, governments are going to understand better the power of AI, and they will want to control it more. And then we get into the military race for real. And for that, there's no like a higher level authority that can set rules, just like governments can set rules for companies. And so the only way around at that point will be international treaties with strong verification of compliance. And that's why I think developing the technologies for compliance, a verification of compliance, is something we need to do quickly.
And that's a first. So developing the technology for assessing risk and safety is a precondition for having an international regulatory regime.
That and things like being able to verify that the other party is using, say, AI chips in ways that were agreed in some treaty. And for now, it's not possible to do it, but it's something that's people think it's technically feasible in the next couple of years.
And that's something you're working on, right? So you're developing you're returning to some of your primary research roots here, aren't you, to develop some of those indicators or technological capacities?
So what I'm working on, I'm trying to do my best to, move the needle towards greater safety for humanity and democracy. And where my expertise, I think, can be most helpful at the scientific level is how do we design future generations of AI systems that give us some mathematical guarantees of safety. And that's going to be important when we move towards the superhuman level. Because right now, you can always hope that we can train these systems by giving them good feedback when they behave well. That's how it's done right now. But when their behavior is something we might not comprehend because they are smarter than us, this strategy is just not going to work. In other words, they might fool us, right? They might do things that look good to us, but actually are about their own goals.
That's a very different way of looking at ultimately regulation than we've treated previous technologies, because we have a notion of guardrails, right? That we as humans are wise enough to put bounds on how technologies can be used. But you're saying that's not the case here, that we need a totally different strategy because guardrails assume we know where this is headed, right? What we're protecting against.
Okay, so there are many aspects to this question. One of them is that we don't know what the right guardrails are. We have some right now, and we should make sure companies are using the ones that we currently know. But as the science of safety improves, those guardrails are going to get better. And those guardrails can be designed so that they work for short-term harms, like dangerous use by terrorists of AI or disinformation. But it should also be working against the catastrophic harm due to loss of human control. Interestingly, there are things that can be done, for example, that have been proposed in the California proposed bill 1047 that help us across the board. So one example that's very obvious is transparency. If we force enough transparency on the companies so that they have to reveal what they're doing to protect the public and the results of these tests, then they will have a strong incentive to behave well. I mean, so long as bad things are happening behind closed doors, they can do a lot of bad things. If that information becomes public, then there will be public scrutiny and they will have an incentive in the first place to avoid doing something dangerous. The other weapon is liability. So whereas the government can't tell this is exactly what you should do because that's going to evolve and the potential misuse is, we don't anticipate. So we need to have an adaptive regulatory framework. So liability also provides that. So what it says is if the companies don't use reasonable care, which is a standard legal term that is used in other sectors. In other words, follow what is considered the state-of-the-art current practice for protecting the public. If they don't do that, and then something bad happens that's caused by their system, then they could be sued. And of course, they don't want to be sued, especially for billions of dollars. And so that will provide an incentive for them to do the right thing and follow the state of the art in safety. So these are not perfect, but these are things we could do right now. And that would also protect against a lot of the shorter term risks that are not existential, but could be very destructive for our societies, in particular our democracies.
I mean, it strikes me that you're now you're at the center of this debate about what a potentially transformative technology could, will, or won't be. You speak to prime ministers and presidents constantly. You're developing this global regulatory model potentially. How do you view your role in this, and how do you deal with that weight and responsibility?
I do my best, and I'm trying to do things that will steer the world in the direction of greater well-being for humanity and democracy, which are like core values. And it's hard, and we need more people engaged. But I feel like I have a duty. If I didn't do it, I would feel bad about myself, about my children and your children and the future. I think that if more people took their responsibility as humans, we would actually solve this problem pretty quickly.
What's the personal weight of that, though? Like you're a person who spent a career in a lab, and now you're being tasked with this immense pressure.
I don't know. I just focus on the actions I can do. And that's, if you think about people who've been involved in like nuclear negotiations or things like this with high stakes for humanity, of course, there's a lot of pressure. But once you get into, okay, so what should I do? How do I do it? How do I do it well? It's just like another job. It's just one that has high stakes, but you do what you can, and that's it.
I mean, we are presented with this technology as a fun, helpful tool at the moment. Do you think that makes it difficult for the public to see how dangerous it could be, or what is being built could be, that's fundamentally different than this almost trivial thing we're being presented with that will just help us in our daily life?
Yes, and I think there's something deeper as well, which is, for most people, including AI scientists, it is difficult to project ourselves in a world where there exist machines that are smarter than us. It's just very difficult. Like the way our brain works is more in the here and now, and imagining things that are very different from what you consider normal, goes against a lot of the way we think. And by the way, the same human psychology is going against us doing the right thing with climate change. It's very difficult for us to think about, what it could be in 20 years from now and how catastrophic it could get, because we look outside, hey, it's nice, and what's the problem? I don't see anyone.
I mean, and that seems to be, going back to what we mentioned this earlier, but that seems to be something that's wrong with us as humans and the way we think, right? We just can't do that. Just like with probability, we're bad at it. Is that something AI could help us with, if it can think differently than us and help us understand the risk that it is?
Yes, actually. So earlier I said I'm working on building AI that is going to be safer, but part of that research program involves building AI that are not agents. In other words, they're not designed to do things in the world, but they're designed to help us think, to help us forecast what would happen, to help us come up with scientific theories to explain what's going on, and to help us see through the complications of the future by just being better than us at thinking and reasoning and coming up with correct anticipation of what could happen. So imagine something like this, much smarter, but designed so that it's not an entity that has its own goals. The problem is, from a commercial perspective, it's very appealing to build AI that has agency, You'd like to have an AI that's going to do things for you on the internet, like negotiate for you and things, and be your secretary or whatever. And of course, that requires a lot of agency. It's very different from building AI that is more like a scientist that knows a lot of stuff and can use their brains to come up with theories, explanations, and be very rigorous about all this.
So just in closing here, what's something you really wish the public understood about AI that they don't at the moment?
There are computer science arguments of how things could go really bad, and there are no counter arguments, and there are no methods that is known how to build AI that will be safe once we reach superhuman capabilities. So we need to figure out all these questions, including that, we're not sure how these things are going to unfold. There's a lot of uncertainty, but we need to bite the bullet of that uncertainty and act accordingly.
Should people be scared of this technology?
Yes, I am scared. Not the current one. The one that will exist in some, unknown number of years that is beyond our own intelligence.
Machines Like Us is produced by Paradigms in collaboration with the Globe and Mail. The show is produced by Mitchell Stewart. Our associate producer is Sequoia Kim. Our theme song is by Chris Kelly. The president of Paradigms is James Millward. Special thanks to Matt Frainer and the team at the Globe and Mail. If you liked the interview you just heard, please subscribe and leave a rating or a comment. It really helps us get the show to as many people as possible.